Sekiguchi's chronicle, It's Not by Accident, is a record of her thoughts tracing the 2011 disaster, with the tsunami and the nuclear disaster right after. It follows Ryoko's spiraling thoughts from the easygoing day before the news to hearing of the news, thinking nothing of it, then calling her parents, then not having them pick up, then the worry, then the panic, then the anxiety, and then hearing of the extent of the disaster and seeing how the world moves forward, how the world goes on, and dealing with her feelings in sharp, witty criticism, in an incredibly intellectual and emotional chronicle of her own personal experience, but one that relates to the experience of so many affected by this disaster. She looks at the nuances of living in this post-catastrophic world and thinks about this in her personal signature reflection, in considering what people would often overlook. For example, I love literature, but I would not be the one to think in times of crises of what book I would be reading in a nuclear disaster, or what the survivors or those stuck in shelters would be reading. Things like that, or things like the cultural shunning of Japanese people and calling them radioactive. Ryoko focuses on things that you wouldn't think of to focus on straight away, and this makes for a fascinating and novel take that is simply unmissable, centering on one reaction and what it says about humanity. Yes, it's deeply emotional, but at the same time, it also enables us to process things intellectually. And I think, of course, it's emotional. And maybe this is something that you would find comfort in, because given recent news and the humanitarian crisis all over the world, and the ecological crisis, and just in general the uneasy times we're living in, there are many moments in this book that will resonate with you, because the way that Ryoko reflects on it, the very human feelings of anger and frustration at first towards French people for reacting the way that they are reacting, for not seeming to pay more attention and then paying at once too much attention, this conflicting take from her perspective as someone who's not in the crisis but who's Japanese and whose cultural identity is very strong, but as someone who has left Japan and has considered her an immigrant for a long time. What that says about her, but it also is something that's deeply challenging and deeply thought-provoking intellectually, because it urges us to consider our own reactions to crisis and the way that the world handles this. From mentioning literary essays to poets to cultural performances in the wake of this disaster, to just in general considering how society rebuilds and what things we ought to consider, what perspectives we ought to take into account. Is there a perspective that we shouldn't take into account? Great writers and the insights you can get from their diaries, this is what Ryoko presents to us, except that unlike these great authors who wrote these diaries utterly unaware that one day somebody would read them, she made the conscious choice to do this, and she's fully aware of her role as a writer. She's fully aware of the implications of what she says. She questions her identity. She asks, have I become whitewashed? Have I become too Western in my perspective? Or is this me questioning myself due to Orientalist implications that I've, been hearing all around me? Is it, do I have a right to say this? What is my role as a writer chronicling this disaster? What is your role as a reader, someone years later reading this? I don't actually know when this was published in the original, but the translation came out literally this year. So many years later, how is it that novels like this still remain relevant, still can manage to touch so much of us? And I think that's truly the mark of a great writer, the way that she balances this emotional aspect of it with posing such academically engaging questions, with creating this debate around the topic that's been somewhat brushed aside in wake of recent events. And the way that she considers her cultural identity is very powerful and very self-aware and very personal, and I appreciate that genuine touch of personal, that intimacy that she creates, because I feel like it is very strongly felt. For example, she mentions how there are certain things that she feels that she takes for granted. For example, moving to France, she had bookshelves built to the ceiling, and she talks about how she was so worried about having these extremely tall bookshelves because she grew up all her life with not having bookshelves that are tall, because during earthquakes these things fall out, there are risks, they can fall, they can damage, they can hurt someone. So, and she mentions that in her Paris apartment, she finally got the chance to do it, and when she expressed her worries and asked for them to be nailed extra tight to the wall, the builders just laughed, because of course they would never understand. But then at the same time, suddenly she's able to wear heels and to walk around. But then back in Tokyo, her parents are selling their piano that she learned to play when she was little, because in earthquakes that's essentially a death machine. So there are just so many small things, and how she expressed this anger towards her parents at hearing the news about her piano because it was of sentimental value, and then they told her of this, that it's a risk during earthquakes, and she paused, and there's no commentary in the book about what she said. There's no commentary on the situation. She ends the chapter and she moves on, and you can tell that that silence is deliberate because, well, she doesn't know what to say. And the fact that she's even let us into this intensely personal moment for her, and one that has clearly affected her so much that she felt the need to include it in the chronicle, I think tells us a lot about the kind of deep innermost reflections that she lets us in on. And there are many moments when Ryoko creates the silence for you to reflect on without pushing you towards an answer, because she has so many questions that she poses but she never once answers them. And I think it's in this space that this cross-cultural exchange of ideas happens. The fact that she gives us the time to ponder at these things and to consider our own reflections. So yes, she can discuss this, she can bring it up, but she never says, this is what I think should have happened, or this is how it all should be, this is what I felt, what do you feel? So she opens up that space for us to feel. And I think that it's in these moments that you can truly understand if you listen, because she allows you to listen, really, to listen uninterrupted, to listen without distractions, to listen to the most pure form of her reflections. And listening, I think, is the way that you can really truly understand. Well, if I had to think of a metaphor, it's, think about it as such. You would never be in her shoes. You will never be standing there in her place as a Japanese woman with family there in a country that's affected by this disaster, that has pushed so hard to kind of break through this post-war, to build a new image. So, like, it used to be this country of progress. Everybody wanted to go to Japan. She said that in the airport, like, the staff used to tell her, oh, you're so lucky that you're Japanese, you get to go to Japan. And now it's suddenly this radioactive country, and everybody's shunning the products, and all the Japanese restaurants are suffering because people don't want to eat sushi because they're worried that the fish was in the sea that's infected. So you will never truly understand that. But in her writing the story that the way that she does, she allows you to see those shoes close, to see what is the shape of the shoe, what's the material, what's the leather. Is this an odd metaphor? Do you feel disconcerted? Do you feel uncomfortable? I think that's like the aspect of this book that I want to reflect in that, because there are many moments where she poses such questions, where she draws such comparison, where she makes these allusions where you think, wow, that's, I never thought of it that way. Oh, oh, I think I start to understand. From expressing why for Ryoko it's not an accident, to chronicling the fact that neither is it exactly fully a coincidence or not a coincidence, she leaves many things open-ended, including the end of the book. Is the disaster still ongoing? That's a question for us to grapple with. And when books have such amounts of space, invariably, yes, there's a sense of incompletion, yes, there's a sense of almost not bringing it to its literary perfection, but at the same time, there's a sense of fullness there, as paradoxical as it sounds, in allowing you to fill in that space yourself, to reflect. There are so many moments where I annotate like pages and pages worth, where I write entire passages based on the spaces that she's left for us to think about them. On a side note, cultural imprints is a theme that I'm always interested in, and it's one that Ryoko Segikuchi explores very subtly here. There are cultural imprints indeed, and I think her comments on the prophetic nature of poets and the way that generations can remember and forget certain events in their history, the way that things establish themselves in the cultural memory of one generation and then the generations right after, is a topic that interests me very much. And on Ad Marginum's part, I think publishing this now was also a very, very subtle comment, but I appreciate, as always, the design, the tradition, what it says, because I think there's a lot to say here about cultural imprints. And I think that books, I've mentioned this before, but I think that books have a tendency to come into your life exactly when you need them most. And I think here, it's a theme that I've been looking to explore more in a slightly different way, and it's a novel that allows me to do that. So if that's something that you're interested in as well, this is definitely a book to watch out for. I hope that you will excuse me for disintegrating into so many personal reflections. It's a somewhat messy review, but I always try to match the vibe of the book I'm talking about, and I just think that it's incredible that Ryoko has managed to turn one woman's personal reaction to the events of 2011 into a chronicle that can resonate with so many people. And it just shows the way that the personal can turn deeply universal. And I think in particular there's one other passage that I just wanted to mention from a personal side. She wrote, "It is felt that people have a need for something else from life aside from the surrounding insanity." That's my rough translation, by the way. It's just about recent needs, and that's what I've been plunged into a spiral about reflecting on. What are your recent needs? What have you been looking for in the wake of all these crises and all these news and this economic crisis and the unsettling and unstable world we live in? And for me, I realized that maybe that's the reason I've been turning so much towards art recently, particularly this year, which I'm sure you have seen on my Instagram. This quote, it made me realize that maybe the reason why I've had this burning, urging need to see art in art galleries, even more so than literature, strangely enough, in recent months, like genuinely, I cannot stop myself. It's a need. Like I feel that I need to be there in another art gallery, is probably because I have felt the need for aesthetics. Maybe that's been my way of allowing myself to see first and then afterwards to use my brain. Because with literature, it's just I analyze straight away, I read straight away. It engages my brain. But with art, it's something that first and foremost comes in through my senses. So it's firstly a pleasure of witnessing this beautiful painting, the colors, and only then, instantly, is it analysis of the origin, of the style, of the movement. Because invariably, I end up focusing more and more into art and finding out more. So it ceases to be simply a viewing of pleasurable experience. It does become something academic after that initial moment of, wow, look at this masterpiece in front of me. And I think that that's the trap, isn't it? That the more you find out, the more you're eager to learn. Knowledge is one hell of a drug. And it's like the more you keep going, the harder it is to come back and to find pleasure in simple things. I don't think I can go back to being that person who knows nothing about art. I can no longer relate to those comments like, oh, that's a nice painting, or oh, I like the colors that are about nothing in particular. I can like the painting, but now the reasons are something that's not purely aesthetic, it's something intellectual. I think it's a deeper appreciation maybe of the art, and it has its own beauty to it. But maybe that's why I've turned towards art. Maybe that's what my needs are, to have more of aesthetics and more simple beauty in my life. But why I wanted to mention this was that as I said, you lose that simplicity a little, and you gain other things in the process. But I just think that's what Ryoko is like. She doesn't have that simplicity. Not quite. It's not a novel that you can read and just find pleasure in mindless beauty. No, it's the way that she subtly says things that are so beautiful. She writes so beautifully, but there's always that undertone of intellectualism there. If you can call it such, maybe I'm not using the right words. She's just, you can feel that always, always. She can appreciate life. And then there's that subtle bit of analysis. And I just think that maybe it's a mindset that I relate to. Because I never once in my life agreed with the phrase that ignorance is bliss. And I think that Ryoko really understands that. So her novels make you appreciate life more in allowing you to gain that deeper understanding of life, and at the same time that deeper appreciation. But at the same time, you can't go back to living life as simply as you did before. In that way, Ryoko still continues to be an author who changes the way that you see life, which I talked about maybe like 2 months ago in my video about Ryoko when I first mentioned her on this channel. So when I finally got my hands on this new copy of this book, I just knew I had to mention this, because I think that's an important part of the literature that we have. And I think it's important that you yourself ask, what are my needs? Why am I responding the way that I'm responding to the events and the circumstances around me? So even with her novels that make me hate the brutality of humanity in certain moments, I still find myself having a wider appreciation for life and for humanity. Because sometimes that's what you need, a story about stories, the coincidences of writers, of humans doing human things. And yes, those include disasters, but yes, those also include the beautiful moments, the utopia of a community gathering together to heal after the world has been torn apart. It's always the story of a soul, and yet immensely and personally the story of one person. So don't expect great arguments and analysis. Don't expect this fabulously deep historical take. Don't expect something novel, some, I don't know, cultural criticism about 2011 that has never been said before, but do expect personal jottings of one great writer in their diary. And if that's what you look for, especially in these uneasy times, look no further than Cinnabon Hazard. I think Luciana, it's not an accident. Thank you so much for watching this review, and I hope you managed to get your hands on a copy.